Companies are across finance and retail and other industries are commemorating Juneteenth, the day that marks the effective end of American slavery. So for more, we want to bring in Scarlet, Bloomberg Equality reporter. She looks at the bottom line impact of diversity. Scar, set it up for us.
Yeah, Juneteenth refers to June 19th, 1865, the day that General Gordon Granger entered Galveston, Texas, where he delivered the news of the Emancipation Proclamation to the slaves there. Texas was the last state in the Confederacy to get word that the Civil War had ended almost 2 months earlier. This holiday became more of a nationwide celebration in the 20th century. And of course, this year, with the Black Lives Matter movement, it's really gained prominence. And corporate America is taking notice. You have Target, JCPenney, Nike, Twitter, even the NFL making it a paid holiday. Big banks, including Citigroup and Bank of America, say employees can take the day off using their vacation days. JP Morgan having shorter holiday hours as well. These are all consumer-facing companies appealing to their customers. And paid holidays, not exactly a huge sacrifice compared with the hard work of fixing institutional racism and discrimination, but it is a start and improvement from the past. Now, policymakers are paying more attention as well. There's a great story in the Bloomberg terminal today where Raphael Bostic, the first Black Fed president in history, talks about his experience with racial profiling. He told our Steve Matthews that the power dynamic of society can leave you exposed in settings you wouldn't think you should have to worry about. Bostic calls for policymakers to take more action to address inequality. And that inequality, Alex, shows up in the latest jobs report, because even though markets hailed the May jobs report for showing a huge improvement, Black unemployment rose in the month to 16.8%, while white unemployment actually declined. So not moving in the direction you want to see it moving in when it comes to certain segments of the population. We know Fed Chief Jay Powell has also talked about how the central bank should consider minorities, women, Blacks, Latinos, Asians when setting policy. And you can see that when you look at wage growth. We have a chart that shows the average weekly earnings of Blacks relative to whites. It only started to rise in late 2018. That was the late stage of the economic expansion, but that is likely moving backwards now, given the latest reports and what we've seen during the pandemic and how African Americans were disproportionately hit by the lockdown. Now, both Bostic and Powell say that they at the central bank can only do so much. The Fed can only lend, it can't spend. That's Congress's job. So Congress really needs to do more when it comes to turning diversity into actual economic inclusion. Alix?
All right, Scar, thanks a lot. That was a really wonderful setup. Scarlet Fu, Bloomberg Senior Markets Editor. So for more on corporate diversity initiatives, we're joining us now is Dame Vivian Hunt, Managing Partner for the UK and Ireland over at McKinsey Company. Dame Vivian, it's great to have you here. And that was sort of the nice micro setup on an economic level, but you talk to companies all the time. It's nice to have the rhetoric. What are some tangible actions that companies are doing right now that actually matter?
Well, first, when we look at the evidence base in some of our recent reports, which Scarlett referred to her in her commentary, Diversity Wins, which is a 5-year report of over 1,000 companies in 15 countries looking at the impact of gender diversity and ethnic and cultural diversity. And it's clearly a positive correlation. We see that the companies that perform well are all more diverse on representation. They're all more diverse in terms of skill sets, and they also proactively manage their workforce with more inclusive practices, every single one of them in every sector in every country. So we're pretty convinced that the correlation with stronger performance and stronger diversity persists. We also see similar correlations when we look at holistic purpose. So taking into account, for example, in your COVID recovery or your company's execution plans, more purpose-led initiatives that might impact the community or your supply chain or your employees. Those companies also have higher performance. So the evidence is strong that it does make a big difference. That said, many companies don't yet do it. Only 1/3 of the companies in our data set have made significant progress in the last 5 years. 2/3 of them still have a long way to go, even just in representation numbers, never mind some of the cultural supporting efforts like acknowledging Juneteenth Day, or more flexible working practices, or indeed anti-bias and inclusion training. So the good thing is what companies can do concretely is pretty clear in hiring, retention, leadership appointments, and inclusive culture. And the companies that have done that have seen better results.
How do companies that have a history or a historical problem, Dame Vivian, deal with this? A number of UK companies over the last 24, 48 hours have put out statements. Green King is one, Lloyd's of London is the other. There will be others. These are companies that have a history with slavery. And I'm wondering how you would advise these companies to deal with that legacy and what the correct posture should be, what the correct communication should be, and whether or not ultimately this could affect their ability to hire quality candidates going down the road as well. How do they manage that history?
First is confidence that the initiatives on inclusion and diversity are not only the right things to do from an ethical or personal perspective, but that it actually impacts your business process. That's why the work that we're doing at the McKinsey Global Institute, the Black Economic Institute that we're setting up, is there so that companies and leaders can have a real fact base on performance and look at both the economic, but also some of the social and other factors that matter. CEOs and leaders have to be courageous. You have to look at the history of your company in full, and some of those parts may not always be favorable. We live in a different time with a different ethical standards and different norms. And at the time that some of the companies were making financing decisions or investing in the triangle trade, obviously it was ethically wrong and human rights abuse, but it wasn't held to that same standard. But today is different. So I would encourage, one, awareness and transparency on your own history. We can't be afraid of our history. We certainly can't change it. And being upfront with your employees for engagement and awareness is the first step. Secondly, concrete initiatives where you are engaging with Black and other historically disadvantaged groups in a new way. So, for example, the statements that the Business Leaders Roundtable or the Canadian Council of Business Leaders, or indeed here in the UK, the CBI, Industry Association, have made are real new steps. The progress we've seen, and even in the last 4 weeks, is a significant gear shift so that companies can now see that history, be accurate and upfront about it, but also now take steps to change their hiring, change their appointment process, debias and train their colleagues, and frankly manage to better, more modern outcomes. It's pretty clear that employees are requiring that customers and supply chains require that, but also given the vulnerability of some of these groups as we build back from the COVID response, those vulnerable populations, whether it's health vulnerability or economic vulnerability, need extra attention to build back better. So companies have an opportunity to really change the narrative, change their actions, and also change the outcomes. So, we'd encourage them to be sort of a bit humble, but also quite concrete in what they do.
I'm just wondering how long those policies for companies last, because now in this social moment, I can see that taking a lot of steam. But as you have to rebrand, as you have to put more money into hiring or mentoring or searches for certain executives, that's all going to take time. It's going to take money. If they have to rebase some supply chains, that's going to take also time and money. How are they going to look at that? Like the trade-off between actual profit and profit margins in the short term versus the longer term vision and the rhetoric?
Well, our data suggests that it's not a trade-off. When you look at the impact of technology, as well as the COVID impact on Black lives and livelihoods in the US, or our global work on diversity wins, it suggests that it's not a trade-off. It's about making those investments with the aperture of how does it impact those vulnerable populations, be they in your employee base, in your customer base, or in your supply chain. So if you take an initiative like diversifying your supply chain, being more engaged and proportionate and having an active set of diverse suppliers as an example, that's not a trade on a supply chain efficiency. It's about working with them to find the right suppliers. And the companies, 1/3 of whom in our data set have made progress in the last 5 years, do exactly those concrete initiatives where the pounds and P, dollars and cents add up, in addition to the increased inclusion and diversity practice. It's not a trade-off between one and the other.
Dame Vivian, I look at what is happening with gender equality and the efforts that are being made there, or the lack of efforts being made there. I'm looking at the FT a website now. All male boards return to FTSE and set back to diversity efforts. This has been something that we have been plugging away for really quite some time and making surprisingly little effort. What should I take away from what has happened with gender equality and apply it to race diversity?
Well, first, that without bold commitments from senior leadership bought in by both their companies and also endorsed by the industry and data, you won't make progress. You have to recognize the problem and commit to make progress. And initiatives like the 30% Club, our own work on the power of parity have started that journey. Secondly, you have to have specific interventions on hiring, leadership appointments, and inclusive culture. Those are the three biggest interventions that a company can make to really affect the diversity and inclusion within their company. You could also see much more community engagement, as many companies are doing as they think about how to recover from COVID. But the companies that have invested in those initiatives, linked them to their performance, have also performed better. Others that haven't done that have simply not moved. And so it's just very interesting when you look at the 5-year data set. 5 years in terms of an economic cycle is not that long. This is an achievable goal in a reasonable period of time within the lifetime of a CEO or an executive team. And secondly, the companies that have set their minds to making progress have done so. So I just think measurement helps. If I'm honest with you, Guy and Alix, I really do believe that the companies that set the actions and measure them are the ones that in our data set have made the most progress. Is it as much progress as there should be? Of course not. In gender terms, we should be at parity in every industry and every company and country around the world. And it takes time to compensate if there are other adjustments that limit women or Black and ethnic minority colleagues from progressing. Educational differences, differences in support and mentorship, social differences. We've seen some of those laid bare in the reaction and impact of COVID. So you have to factor those things in as we build back better. But the companies who've done it, both on economic development as well as relative performance within their sector, have performed better.